The game I'm about to show you was played in the last round of a very powerful open tournament in Bad Weiss, Germany, late November of '97. My score was 6-2 going in, and my opponent was a strong Czechoslovakian Grandmaster named Pavel Blatny. There were about 30 Grandmasters in the tournament, and a win would mean a tie for second or third place, so this was the money round. Now, while the study of chess can be a pure, introspective process, the unpredictable nature of competition can often spiral the game away from the poetic and into the brutality of a street fight. A large aim of practical chess study is to develop the intuition so that you'll be completely prepared for carnal war. I study variations in complex positions not to remember them specifically, but to gain the feeling that I have after the study. Then the moves fall away, and all that is left is a peaceful nothingness, which I think is the core of intuitive growth. It is beautiful and essential to swim in the abstract beauty of chess ideology, but we must not lose touch with the dog-eat-dog reality that defines competition. The conditions are always less than perfect. Distractions and ways to be thrown off are countless. In the moments when the chess struggle descends to the level of a desperate animal fight for survival, we have to be resilient and prepared for any crazy twist of events. This game began with a hitch. It was the 9th and final day of a grueling event. The first 8 games had all started at 3 o'clock, so I developed a pre-game routine. I would wake up in the morning, go outside, and breathe the mountain air while walking over to eat breakfast next door. I would sit, sipping coffee, reading War and Peace for a while, then would head back and prepare for my game because the pairings would already be posted. Then my best friend Maurice Ashley and I would take off and throw around the football for a while. We would grab lunch, I would go back to my room, shower, meditate, and off to battle. A pretty peaceful rhythm. This morning, on the other hand, I was sleeping around 9:30 and there was a pounding on my door. I wandered out of bed, opened the door, and there was Maurice, wide-eyed, saying, "Josh, man, the game starts in half an hour." The last round was at a different time than all the rest. We hadn't realized, and he had somehow woken up with a sense of it. So I got up, walked over to the breakfast spot, felt like Jack Kerouac up digging those gorgeous mountains. I got to the playing hall a few minutes late, my clock was started, the e-pawn came out, bring it on. My opponent responded with e5, which is the most solid system in his repertoire, as I've seen him play for many years. I played knight f3, knight c6. In this position I have 2 main openings that I play. Bishop c4, the Italian, is what I've been playing for the longest, and it's a positional opening which is very solid, very good, and if you have a strong positional understanding, you can play this position quite well. I have a lot of confidence in it. In this particular game, I decided to play a different system because I wanted the game to be unbalanced and atypical. I played knight c3. He played knight f6, g3. So this opening is something which is relatively new in terms of being popular in Grandmaster chess. The idea is my development will involve playing bishop g2, castle and kingside, and depending on how he plays, either trying to control the open files in the center or beginning a kingside attack with knight h4 and f4. So I'm going to have a very interesting scheme of development, and based upon his plan, I will develop some kind of initiative. After g3, he played bishop c5. I played bishop g2, d6, d3. So already, in fact, I have a threat. If you take a moment and try to figure out what my next move will be, you'll see what black's response should be. Typical of double king-pawn openings, in this position my idea is to play knight a4. The point being, his dark square bishop is suddenly trapped by my knight. I'm going to win a knight for bishop one way. If he plays bishop b6, I'll take it. And if bishop b4 check, c3, bishop a5, after bishop a5, b4 chases the bishop back to b6, where I can take it with my knight whenever I want to. The reason that the bishop on c5 is such a valuable piece for black is twofold. For one thing, this position right now is a closed center. The relationship between bishop and knight is one which is very flexible. The bishop is considered to be slightly better than the knight, and yet they're both considered to be worth about 3 pawns, which is strange. In fact, in an open game, the bishop is slightly more powerful than a knight, but in a closed game, the knight can often be slightly better than the bishop. This double king pawn position is right now not open, but it has the flexibility to open up. In other words, if I play an f4 break or a d4 break, or my opponent plays a d5 break, the game will explode and the bishops will become very important. Also, odds are I'm going to castle kingside. With his dark square bishop on c5, the plan of my playing f2 to f4 opens up my king. If his dark square bishop is gone, then I can play the move like f4 without conceding anything, without conceding any safety of my king. This is a very important piece for him. So after I played d3, he defended against the threat by playing a6. We can see already that The thought process of both of us in this game is based upon what is my opponent's threat. This is something which will develop as we go along. After a6, I castled, and my opponent at this point chose his scheme of development. He played bishop g4, an immediate pin of my knight, which I had relieved by playing h3, and he played bishop e6. So by playing bishop g4, he provoked my playing h3, which I don't mind playing, but the one problem with it is that he wants to play queen d7 next move, attacking my pawn on h3, and then castle queenside. So he wants to see what I do, and then play with that plan. In this position, I made a strange move. I played the move king h2, which doesn't seem to have much immediate value, but it does, in fact, because I'm defending my h3 pawn because I see that sooner or later he's going to move his queen to d7. And also, I'm getting off the diagonal of the a7 to g1 dark squared bishop. So when I play f2 to f4, I won't have to worry about that pin. So king h2 is a move where I wait for black to decide what he's going to do before choosing my own path. After king h2, he played the move h6, which is the correct decision. The point being, his most natural move is to play queen d7. But after queen d7, I will play knight g5, and his bishop will suddenly have been trapped on e6, and once again we see the small gain of knight for bishop. After I win his bishop from my knight, I will be able to open up the game with a move like f2 to f4 with a very clear conscience because I'll have the two-bishop advantage in the open game. So he plays h6 to stop that. And here I played bishop e3. Now, the order of my moves in this opening, my last two moves, was very tricky. In fact, I could have played bishop e3 before king h2. And here black is tempted into a very specific central action. And he, in my opinion, played an incorrect decision here. He played bishop takes e3. I believe that the best decision for black would have been to play queen d7, allowing me to have this option of bishop takes c5, d takes c5. Take a moment and look at this position. At first it might seem like white has gained something and that he's doubled the black pawns, but my opinion about this position is that it's perfectly fine for black. It's true that he has a slight weakness in the center, but the c5 pawn can be defended whenever it wants by playing b6. And now the difference in the centers is that black has a mobile center and white's center is very static. Black will probably castle queenside, have the d-file, and he has the flexibility to play c5 to c4 whenever he wants. So my center can potentially come under attack while his is much more flexible. He has a slight weakness, but for that weakness he has a dynamic to his play. My opponent, instead of playing queen d7, played a very specific idea of bishop takes e3, f takes e3, d5. Now I've learned through playing the Italian, the opening I described with my bishop on c4 in the double king pawn positions. My feeling was that in this moment d5 was an incorrect move. Now the only question is to figure out how. My opponent was also playing very quickly. He's a very fast player, which brings up an interesting psychological question of how to deal with a very fast opponent. Some players choose to play quickly against a fast opponent, while other players tend to slow down. What's difficult is that your recovery time, the time to relax on your opponent's move, is taken away, and it can be very intimidating. You can perceive your opponent's speed as a form of confidence, but in fact, their speed can actually be a form of nervousness, their inability to sit patiently within a complex position. After my opponent played d5, there were two options that I immediately saw. One was to play a very tactical, concrete, specific variation. E takes d5, knight takes d5, and then a long variation which I will describe. The other was to play the move knight h4, which in fact is the decision that I made. After this move I saw my position would be slightly better. After e takes d5 I saw a long variation which was trying to win immediately. Let me show you the variation that I analyzed. After e takes d5, knight takes d5. Knight takes d5, bishop takes d5. I was looking at the variation knight takes e5. Here, black's most obvious move is knight takes e5, and I was looking at the position after queen h5. This looks very tempting. I'm attacking the knight on e5, and if the knight moves away anywhere, I will be attacking the bishop on d5 twice. If he plays bishop takes g2, I play queen takes e5 check, followed by taking back the bishop on g2, and my position will be very good. I'll be up a pawn, and in fact winning. It's very hard to defend the knight on e5, because if he plays the move f7 to f6, we see immediately, of course, this is illegal. My queen on h5 would take the king on e8. The only way to defend the knight on e5 would be to play queen d6, after which I was intending the move rook f5, piling up the attack. But then after all this, what I saw is that this is impossible, because black can simply castle And after I play rook takes e5, he has the move bishop takes g2, king takes g2. And after the end of this very long variation, he has the quiet g6, attacking my queen. My queen can't move anywhere to defend my rook, and I lose a rook. So this very long variation, which I just described, came out of a lot of chess study, a lot of analysis, a lot of mathematical work. In fact, my intuition told me very quickly that I shouldn't have done this. And in fact, black had another strong idea against this. If we look back at the variation after e takes d5, knight takes d5, knight takes d5, bishop takes d5, knight takes e5, he had another move, bishop takes g2, which his idea is if I play king takes g2, then after knight takes e5, I'm down a piece. So what I had looked at is knight takes f7 here. But here my opponent would have had the move queen d7, getting out of the knight's attack and threatening queen takes h3 check. My only reasonable move, as you can see, is king takes g2. And then he has the simple idea of castling kingside. And suddenly my knight is trapped on f7. What I've just shown you are two variations which refuted very long tactical lines which I could have considered. The second one I in fact didn't see. The first one I did see. But the point is that I should have felt before going into these variations that it was wrong to be so tactical, because the position didn't call for it yet. And there's a very, very specific danger in calculating very long variations. And when you're playing a chess game, if you start calculating long variations, you have to check them carefully, because it's very easy to have a flaw in your analysis. And the theme of each of the two moves that ended the variations, and this one you've just seen, castling kingside, and the one earlier, g7 to g6, attacking my queen on h5, it's the hardest kind of move to see, the quiet move after a long, complicated variation. So remember, when you're looking at long lines, look for the quiet move in the middle of them, or at the end of them. You might see something very unexpected. So I decided to play knight h4, and I calculated the variation which he played, d4. We can see quickly that if he plays d takes e4, after knight takes e4, knight takes e4, bishop takes e4, white has a very strong position because my light-squared bishop is centrally placed and I can move off to the queen side or the king side at will. I have open lines and white is much better. Also notice that my knight on h4 is crashing in on the f5 square whenever it wants to. My opponent couldn't open up my g2 bishop. One of the aspects of this opening which is very important is that I'm fiend shadowing my bishop into the blockade of my own e4 pawn. But in all of the central breaks which happen either through black playing d5 or f5, that e4 pawn will disappear. So potentially my bishop is very strong while immediately it's a little bit restricted. And here we moved into a position which we both evaluated very differently. After d4 I played e takes d4, knight takes d4, knight f5. That piece has to be taken care of immediately because it's too strong. Black played bishop takes f5. If he plays knight takes f5, after e takes f5, black's in trouble because the game is opening up with his king still in the center. My bishop on g2 has become very strong, and his bishop on e6 is under attack. He would be in trouble. But my opponent played correctly. Bishop takes f5, e takes f5, c6. I had seen, when I played the move knight h4, this position, had planned knight e4, which I played, knight takes e4, bishop takes e4. And it's from here that the game begins. Take a moment and have a look at the position. What do you think? First of all, we can see that black has a very strong knight on d4. White has a bishop on e4, which is well placed in the middle of the board. It seems to be blocked in by my f5 pawn. And his c6 and b7 pawn battery has a very strong influence on my bishop. It restricts it. On the other hand, my pawn on f5 is very inconvenient for him. It makes castling kingside unpleasant. My bishop on e4 has it's scoping out in either direction. It has the potential to be a very forceful piece. In reaching this position, my opponent thought that he was better here, while I thought that I was better. And I still hold to the idea that white in this position has an advantage. But now, I want you to, in the course of this game, try to gain a feeling for the thought process that was involved in both of our play. Take a moment and think about what white's threat is. What is his strongest piece on the board? The knight on d4. Now, a difference which you have to notice between his knight on d4 and my bishop on e4 is that his knight on d4 can be attacked. The move c3 kicks it out. My bishop on e4 can never be attacked, unless his knight moves away from the d4 square to the more passive d6 square, in which case I can retreat to g2 and have a lot of flexibility from there. No pawns can attack my bishop, and I have a pawn that can attack his knight. So when evaluating the power of a given piece, it's important to understand whether or not their position is stable or very transient. My bishop has a stable position, while his knight can be kicked out at will. My threat is surprisingly strong. The position may seem rather balanced. We each have one minor piece. Things look about even. If I play the move a4, suddenly his knight on d4 is trapped. My next move would be c3, and his knight has no squares. There's nowhere to go. So in fact, in this relatively calm-looking position, there's a lot of venom in my ideas. a4, a quiet-looking simple move, would trap his knight on d4. My opponent saw that and played knight b5. From this moment, I began to attack. The thought process behind my attack was very different from how you might normally consider an attacking player's frame of mind. When you think of the word attack, how do you feel? In your vision of a chess attack, does it seem like a rush forward? The attack against a king is almost defined, I think, in most people's mind, by a rush at the king, by pieces storming in on him, by him being alone in the air flowing at him, knights, bishops, queens, rooks, crashing in on a guy. What I'm going to show you is from this moment on in the game, I attacked his king not so much by going forward, but by not letting him get away. What is my opponent's idea? In fact, by playing knight b5, he was avoiding a very strong idea of mine, the trapping of the knight into this in the center, and he's created a very powerful blockading strategy. His next move is going to be queen f6, blockading my f5 pawn. The following move will be knight d6. Suddenly the whole position has transformed. My bishop on e4 is completely blockaded. My pawn on f5 has no mobility. His knight on d6 is attacking my bishop and take it whenever he wants. This is a very important principle which I discuss with my students, the idea of tension between pieces. Here, his knight on d6 has tension on my bishop on e4, while my bishop on e4 is not returning that tension. So he has the option to take, while I don't have that option. If you were to consider, for instance, if his knight were on d5 instead and my bishop were on e4, here I would have tension on the knight, meaning I can take whenever I want. So in all the tactical possibilities of the position, I have the option of capturing it at any moment. This is a very important theme relative to the dynamic of two different pieces, the idea of tension between them. If you go back to the position of his queen on f6, knight on d6, suddenly all of my central play has become static. He has tension on my bishop. If my bishop moves back, my f5 pawn becomes very weak. Then he can castle either queenside or kingside and develop an attack against my king. Things can suddenly turn bad. So by the move knight b5, it's a typical prophylactic move. He's stopping my threat and creating a very powerful and yet detached one himself. Grandmaster threats are not easy. Well, you might not have seen that I was threatening a4 to win a piece. You also might not have seen that the threat of queen f6 and knight d6 blockades my bishop. So now ask yourself, after you've seen black's threat, what should white do about it? I played the move f5 to f6. Now take a minute and look at that. Boom. Big move, pawn sacrifice, I'm coming at him. If you had looked at the position, if you had quickly played through the moves of this game, and my opponent had played knight b5 and you had seen white playing f6, you would have said attacking move. Yes, this is an attacking move. But notice the thought process that led me to it. My opponent's next move was queen f6, blockading the f5 pawn. I'm stopping my opponent's idea and attacking at the same time. So I came to the aggressive move through prophylactic thought. And this when I describe the ideas of soft is hard in chess, and the movements between different extremes defining one another. In this instant, I came to a very hard attacking move through a very soft, flexible, defensive prophylactic strategy, or thought process. After f6, my opponent has a problem. If he plays g takes f6, then he's completely weakened his pawn structure, and after queen g4, my next move is going to be queen g7, attacking his rook on h8. Of course, he can never castle kingside anymore. His f6 pawn is going to go. He's in a lot of trouble. After queen g4, my next two moves are going to be queen g7, and if I can take on f6 immediately, that's fine. If I need to, I can play rook f2 and rook f1. White has all the attack, and black would be in huge trouble. If you take a moment and look at the position after g takes f6, queen g4, you'll see quickly that white has a dynamic, brutal attack. My opponent played the sensible response, g6. Now my bishop on e4 looks a little better. It's not hemmed in by its own pawn. What would you play as white? Now we want to attack, yes, but what is black's next move? He can no longer blockade my bishop on e4. That will be a good piece. His plan at this point is to castle kingside. If I attack his h6 pawn, he'll play the move king h7. And then he's going to slowly round up my f6 pawn. Play the move rook e8, rook e6. If he wants to, his knight can come back to d6, even back to e8. My f6 pawn, instead of being a bone in his throat, is going to be a weakness that I have to defend for the rest of the game. So after I played f6, a very big attacking move, he responded with g6, and suddenly we see that black has a plan. He wants to castle kingside, defend the h6 pawn if he needs to, and then round up my f6 pawn. How do I stop that? I prevented him from castling with queen d2. A very quiet, soft move, based upon a big attack. I'm keeping his king in the center. If he castles kingside, queen takes h6, and mate next move. He's gone. So by playing the move queen d2, I've stopped his whole scheme of development. Now the question really was how to develop my queen. Queen e2 was possible, queen f3 was possible, queen g4 was possible. All the different moves have pluses, but only one of them was a truly strong one. The other point which I want you to realize is that every chess move that we make leaves a space behind. When I played the move f6, while I was preventing his idea of blockading with queen f6 and knight d6, I was also giving up control of the e6 square. So now his knight on d4 would be a much stronger piece. He might come back to d4, because after c3 he'll have the option of retreat to the e6 square, which he didn't have before, and then that knight can spring to g5 or c5 and undermine my bishop on e4. So after he played knight b5, he left the e6 square, so I played f6, leaving the e6 square myself, and after g6 I played the move queen d2. Now he has the option later on of returning to d4 and coming back to e6, but to do it immediately would be a little too slow. His king is still in the center. He played queen d6. And now take a moment. What would you do with white? Base your thought process on black's idea. My opponent's plan now, since I've stopped him from castling kingside, and he has to get the king out of the center, is to castle queenside. Now my whole idea of attack is to play the moves a4 and b4. His knight will move away, and then eventually to break open his queenside with the move b4 to b5, which forces him to make a decision. Let's say that his knight is on the e6 square, isn't controlling the b5. After he takes on b5 2 times, the game is virtually over. His king is suddenly wide open. My bishop on e4 is penetrating the b7 square. My rook on a1 can come down to a8 or a7 if it wants to. Black is completely finished. His king is wide open, and my attacking pieces will just lunge at him. If he does have a knight on d4 instead of e6, it's still a very powerful idea, but it involves a pawn sacrifice. If he decides to meet this move with a takes b5, a takes b5, knight takes b5, then he'll have opened up the a file. My rook will be very strong. If he decides to close the a file and play c takes b5, a takes b5, knight takes b5, while the a file will be closed, my bishop will have suddenly opened up onto the b7 point. A very dangerous option because the b file will open and the b7 pawn is a key defender to black's king position. So what you see is that I have the option, if he castles queenside and I get a4 and b4 in, of attacking him very quickly with a pawn sacrifice, which would force him to open up his king in one way or another, which you'll see later on in the game. The question is how? I can't simply begin an all-out attack on the king because it's not there yet, and if later on he decides to stay in the center or go kingside if he can, things will be fine. If I play the move a4, he'll play knight d4. Now I can't play c3, kicking the knight out of the center, because of the move knight b3, forking my queen on d2 and my rook on a1. His knight on d4 is very strong, and it doesn't really make any sense for me to begin a huge queenside pawn storm with something like b4 before his king is castled queenside, because now obviously he wouldn't go there. You don't want to just lunge in a direction where you think your opponent's going to go, because then he could decide not to. So the question is, how do I improve my queenside attacking possibilities without completely losing all flexibility in my position? I played the move b2 to b4. After the game, my opponent said to me, after we looked at that in the post-mortem, "I simply do not understand that move at all." He thought it was a bad move. I personally think that I think this may be the best move of the game. It's a very strange move to play because it's expanding on the queen side, attacking absolutely nothing. Simply because I know that when he castles queenside, I'm going to increase my attacking time. After a4, my pawn will already be on b4. This move makes it much harder for him to expand. He played the move queen d6 to d4. If he castled queenside, I would play a4, and my attack would come quickly. b4 was another very strong attacking move, but the reason it was an attacking move is because it was a prophylactic move. It was stopping black from going where he wanted to go, keeping the king in the center. My opponent, in turn, took the space that I left behind. He played queen d4. Now, for one thing, he's occupying the c3 square. His idea will later be to play knight c3, maybe even queen c3, and knight d4. But you can see that by playing b4, I've weakened my dark squares. But my opponent now has another idea as well. He wants to castle queenside. After castles queenside, he'll have an added threat to his position. What is it? If I were to go on with my attack and play a move like a4, he would surprise me pretty badly by suddenly throwing in queen takes e4. My pawn on d3 is pinned to my queen on d2. So by playing queen d4, black has done something very serious. He's made the move castling queenside an attacking move. Now I have a little bit of an issue. If after queen d4 I play a4, he's going to play the move knight d6. My bishop on e4 is attacked. And after my bishop comes back to g2, he's going to play the move knight c4, attacking my queen on d2. And after she moves, he's going to play the move knight e3, attacking my rook on f1 and my bishop on g2. And suddenly my attack has been frozen. Black's game is perfectly fine, and he has the initiative. So after my opponent played queen d4, his idea is that both a4 is impossible. Castle and queenside will come with threat. What should I play? I played the move bishop g2, responding to his attack before it's even there. Another example of prophylactic thought. And now black has to make a decision. He has to make a committal move. And here he castled queenside. So you can see that what's been happening is he's wanted to castle queenside for a while now, and I've slowly been improving my attacking position. And we've reached a moment where I finally play a4. He plays knight d6. What should I play? There are different options here. For one thing, you may want to run ahead with b5. But this would be a mistake. It's coming a little too fast. After b5, a takes b5, a takes b5, knight takes b5. I don't really have compensation for the pawn. I don't really see what to do. He has strong central play. His knight is coming into c3 if it wants to. His king will be alright in the center. There's no real way to justify the pawn sacrifice. I have that to hold for later. His queen on d4 is bothering me. Should I play c3, pushing it away? No, that would be a mistake too. He plays the move knight c4. If I take his queen on d4, then he takes my queen on d2. He's attacking my rook, and after I attack his knight, he'll simply play the move knight to b3, attacking my other rook, followed by knight takes d4. Black will be up a pawn. I'm in trouble. If after knight c4 I move my queen, then he'll take the d3 pawn, and I'll be much worse. So we see that black's decision to castle queenside was filled with venom. I can't kick out his queen with c3. My attack with b5 is a little premature. In this position, without white moving, what is black's threat? His next two moves, if I don't move, are knight c4, attacking my queen. I remember my d3 pawn is pinned. And after my queen moves, entering my game with knight e3, attacking the rook and my bishop on g2. And after my bishop on g2 leaves the board, my attack against his king will be weakened. The bishop on g2 is a huge attacking piece in this game, because after his c6 pawn leaves, it's going to knife into the b7 point and he'll be in a lot of trouble. So we see his idea. What do we do about it? There's a temptation in chess to think about the first layer. So when I said, what do we do about it? What's our move? You might have thought, how do I stop knight c4? Okay, that's one way to go about things. But is knight c4 in itself so powerful? No. The move that's powerful is knight e3. I played the move rook f to e1. Now this might not seem like an attacking move, but it is. I'm stopping my opponent's idea and preparing a huge attack, but just properly. If he plays knight c4 now, after my queen goes back to c1, his last move looked ridiculous. The knight can't come into e3 square, and the only thing to do since it's now attacked is to go back to d6. So rook fe1 made his idea silly, and it completely stopped the natural progression of his development. The way that black would like to continue with his game would be to play the move rook h to e8. But now he can't do that because the h6 pawn will be under attack from my queen on d2. At this point, what I've done, first of all, I drew black into castle and queenside. And then what I did just now is I drew black because it was the only option he had into breaking open the center by playing e5 to e4. It looks like a strong move. My opponent played it confidently and quickly. He's planning on taking on d3. There's a principle that the best way to respond to flank attack, which is what I'm developing with b4, with my b4 to b5 break, is to respond with a central break. My opponent did that himself. But I had seen that after with my rook on e1, when he plays e4, now the move b4 to b5 would be strong. Why? What's the difference? For one thing, his pawn on e4 is weak. Another thing is that my rook on e1 is suddenly going to be on an open file, penetrating down to the e7 square. If you look at this position now, you'll see that it's exploding. Suddenly the position is filled with craziness. My moves have been quiet, slow, stopping my opponent's ideas, but in fact they've all been based upon a very harsh attacking scheme. I'm going after his king. I stopped him from running away. He opened up the center because he had no choice. I forced him into the pretense of aggression. And now b5. Imagine you're in black's position right now. What would you do? Let me begin by saying that the idea of flinging out a move like knight c4 is completely useless because it just attacks my queen, and after my queen moves, you're going to have too many other issues to worry about. Say the move queen to b4. Black's in big trouble. There are really two ways to handle the situation. Black can play a takes b5, a takes b5, knight takes b5, which concedes the open a file. Or he can play c takes b5, a takes b5, knight takes b5, which keeps the a file closed and opens up my bishop on g2 to the b7 square. Which one would you be more tempted to play? Notice also that if he were to forget about all the queenside play and play e takes d3 in the center, after b takes c6 or b takes a6, black would be in huge trouble. His whole king side is opening up. My rooks will penetrate along the open files, and black is going to be in huge difficulty very soon. He needs to immediately deal with my b5 pawn. Which decision would you make? Most people would tend to want to keep my rook on a1 and play c takes b5, a b5, knight takes b5, and this in fact is what my opponent did. I felt that the other decision was correct, which is strange. My bishop on g2 is the most important piece in the game. Now this might seem like a completely bizarre statement about a piece which is sitting next to my king, far away from my opponent's king, blocked in by a pawn that looks active on e4. But I saw that maybe the most important part of black's defensive game was these b7 and c6 pawns, which completely cut off the mobility of my g2 bishop. After c takes b5, a b5, knight takes b5, which he did, my bishop on g2 has a target, the b7 point. It's suddenly become a very active piece. If he had instead played a takes b5, a takes b5, knight takes b5, I would have played the move queen f4. Now this might seem strange at first. You'd want to play rook a8 check. Boom, we have a check, let's do it. But in fact, moves like that are often better kept as potential as opposed to converted into immediate energy. If rook a8, after my opponent responds with king d7, my rook has to immediately be traded. Rook takes d8, rook takes d8. I've lost a very important attacking piece, and his king is actually pretty safe. It can come back to c8 if it wants to, and it's hard to attack it on d7. After the move queen f4, though, rook a8 check will be much more interesting. Plus, if he plays the tempting e takes d3, we see that I have forced mate. Rook a8 check, king d7, rook e7 mate. So by playing one patient move, what I've done is I've said, you have no way to improve your position, and I'm going to develop the attack. After queen f4, my opponent pretty much has to stop rook a8 check. He plays knight c7. And then I would respond with bishop takes e4. And we have a normal chess position in which white has a big advantage. My bishop on e4 is very strong. I have an attack against his king which is opened up. I'm going to put rooks on b1 and a1, pile up on the b7 pawn. He's in trouble, but the position is playable. I think this was slightly better because my attack doesn't come immediately. On the 24th move, my opponent chose to play cb5, and after ab5, knight b5. A decision which most people would probably make. What should I do? Now, I've just sacrificed a pawn. We might want to take it back with bishop takes e4. Be careful, don't take it back with the rook on e4. Queen takes a1 would make us look kind of bad. Your reaction to this kind of position could easily be emotional. You could feel the need to run forward. You could feel the need to play mechanically, automatically, without thinking about your opponent's ideas. But when you play against strong players, they're constantly responding to your ideas and creating their own at the same time. Here my opponent has a very specific defensive plan. If I play the automatic bishop takes e4, what he wants to do is plant a knight on d6. Now my bishop on e4 is threatened, so it should come back to g2. After my bishop comes back to g2, we can see that my f6 pawn is very weak. He can take it immediately, for instance, with queen takes f6. And I've been describing how my bishop on g2 was so important because it keyed in on the b7 point. But if his knight is allowed to anchor on d6, he defends that point very well. It's hard to continue the attack with the knight on d6. So, in this position, in which he has a pawn on e4 that I can take a number of different ways, my pawn on f6 is hanging, things look strange, but his king is open, it's easy to be caught up in the emotion and the passion of the attack. We might just easily take on e4, but now we've taken a moment, we've seen black has a strong defensive idea, which is very similar, notice, to the blockading idea he had before, when my pawn was on f5, of putting a queen on f6 and a knight on d6. Now he wants to put the knight on d6, which will nullify the effect of my bishop on g2. What did I do? I played a very crazy-looking move, c4. Now, if you were to see the move c4, again you'd think, wow, he could take back a pawn, but instead he's just running forward. But that's not the essence of the move. The reason that it's correct to play such a move is because I'm stopping his knight from anchoring on d6. First thing we should note, of course, is that queen takes c4, trying to use the d3 pawn's pin, would lose after rook e to c1. I win a queen because it's pinned to his king. That tactic wouldn't work for black. He has to move his knight. If he tries to put the knight on d6, I still wouldn't take back the pawn, but would play c5. My pawn is moved from c2 to c4 to c5. His knight on d6 is attacked. It has to come back to b5. I should note that if he chooses to come to c4 now, it's still not a problem. After queen a2, his knight is attacked. He'll play queen takes d3, and after I play the move c6, his entire queen side has fallen apart. The b7 pawn is leaving, and the a6 pawn will become a goner. His king on c8 will have no defenses. He'll get mated. If he were to play knight c4, after the simple move queen a2, e takes d3, or queen takes d3, I have the very simple move c5 to c6, shedding the last of his defenses. The b7 pawn has to respond somehow, because I'm threatening c takes b7, and then queen takes a6. His a6 pawn will fall. Black is going to have absolutely nothing between his king and my queen, rook, bishop, and other rook. He's going to get mated. So, if he were to play knight d6, c5, he would have to play knight to b5, and then the pawn that began on c2 would continue its trek, c6. And black in this position is in fact completely lost. My threat is c takes b7 check. He would play b takes c6. I would play rook takes a6. Notice all this time that this central tension has existed. The pawn sitting on e4, everything can be captured. But his king on c8 has nothing to defend it. Rook takes c6 check is a threat. The e4 pawn is gonna leave the board soon, which will bring another piece, my bishop on g2, onto the c6 point. He can't defend it enough. Natural attacking moves for me now, like rook a8 check or queen a5, not to mention rook c1 piling up on c6, are gonna come. Black is in a lot of trouble. He's gonna lose. Always in this kind of position, it's important to notice the pawns in front of the king. What I'm doing is I'm completely busting through all of the black's defenses. All these pawns are leaving, and the king is going to be left alone. After c4, my opponent's defensive scheme is challenged. So after c5, my opponent would have to play knight b5. And now his pawns are destroyed by the further surge c5 to c6. Notice all this action of the c-pawn, my c-pawn kind of warping up from c2 to c6, attacking the knight each step of the way, has happened with this pawn, this black pawn, simply sitting on e4 ready to be taken at any point, and thus my d3 pawn sitting there ready to be taken. But no one had time. After c6, my opponent would probably play b takes c6, and when I play rook takes a6, most players would feel that black is in perilous danger. His c6 pawn is attacked, and it's important to note that since his e4 pawn is by definition going to disappear from the board because it's attacked so many times, the c6 pawn will come under yet another attack of my bishop on g2. Black is in big trouble. By playing c4, I challenged black's defensive idea and made him come up with a new one, which in fact he did, very resiliently. So again, now knight d6, the best defensive square, is off limits for him. He played knight a7. So I pushed him away from his main move. I played bishop takes e4, and he played the very strong move rook d6. Chess games against grandmasters are not won easily. My opponent has responded consistently and thoroughly to my ideas, and now he's developed a new way of defending the b7 pawn, blockading my bishop on e4 with his knight on c6. Now, this will create a tension, which is to my advantage. Earlier I discussed the relationship between pieces. If his knight is sitting on c6, and my bishop is sitting either on e4 or g2, or anywhere on that diagonal, my bishop has the option of taking the knight whenever it wants, which he has to constantly consider. And his knight doesn't have any luxury. It has to sit there, and its lone goal in life is to blockade my bishop. So while he has discovered a way to stop my attack on b7 temporarily, he's exposed himself to a tension which is very unfavorable. Also, you may notice that my f6 pawn is attacked twice by his rook on d6 and his queen on d4. It's even material, so that pawn is going to go sometime. I'm sacrificing a pawn here for the attack, but that's part of the game. After rook d6, I improved my rook a1 to b1, and he defended the b7 pawn with the blockade I discussed before, knight c6. What's happened now is very interesting. It's important to consider the emotional, the psychological reality of the game, as well as just the chess moves. If you think about what happened, earlier I started to develop this way of attacking his king by not letting it run first to the king's side, then to the queen's side. Then I let it go to the queen's side. I opened things up on the queen's side. I stopped some of his defensive ideas with refined attacking ideas, and he responded to them by developing a new strategy of defense. If we get emotional, and if we get excited and we want to just keep on going, attack, 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 against a good defensive player, we'll simply lose, run into a wall, boom, and the game will be over. Here black has parried my first ideas very well. My f6 pawn is going to go. How do I continue my attack? Take a couple minutes now. Think about what white should do. What black has done is he's first of all taken away the key b4 square from my queen. I'd like to play queen b4 and attack the b7 pawn. Also, the b2 square, queen b2, is impossible because his queen defends that square. Obviously, I don't want to be trading off pieces now when I'm attacking. My f6 pawn is being taken soon. What would you do? Maybe your immediate option is to play bishop takes c6. Try to juice up black's defenses. Try to loosen him up a little bit. That would be a big mistake. First of all, in the abstract, when you have a tension in the game where you have the ability to take one of your opponent's pieces whenever you want, and your opponent has no such ability to control the situation, you don't want to do it right away. If I had played bishop takes c6, after rook takes c6, the tempting idea of rook to e7, for instance, could be met by my opponents playing rook c7, stopping the attack. And now I've lost a valuable attacking piece, which can be given up whenever it wants to be given up, and black's defenses are fairly resilient. It's also important to notice that my bishop on e4, while a big attacking piece, is a huge defensive piece. If you envision it sitting back on g2, my king looks very safe. If you take my light squared bishop off the board, you see that if my queen leaves the d2 square, suddenly queen f2 check is a very violent move. My king is completely exposed. So the bishop on e4 has both defensive and aggressive intentions, and this entire game is of the theme of attacking through less than direct means. My bishop on e4 is very flexible. I played the move queen d1. Remember earlier I played the move queen d1 to d2, stopping him from going kingside. Now I played the move queen d2 to d1. In this attacking game, my queen has moved twice, one square, each time. Why did I do that? It's a very flexible move. For one thing, my queen is knifing out to the b3 square, which would attack b7, which will be tough to defend. Also, the option of queen g4 check is very important. Both these ideas are very important from a strictly attacking point of view, but there's another truth behind the position. Black was threatening to play rook takes f6. If you imagine that it were black's move, after rook takes f6, first of all I've lost a pawn, and second of all he has a threat, rook f2 check, winning my queen on d2. This would be very tough to handle. I will have lost a pawn, while my position would still be okay, because of an attack. I'm letting him take material with tempo, with time, gaining time and material at the same time. I don't want to give him that option. He also has the possibility of playing queen on d4 takes f6, but that's a much more awkward move. First of all, his queen on d4 is a well-centralized piece, and second of all, it doesn't come with tempo, it doesn't threaten anything, and it moves the queen further away from the defense of his own king. So the real question is how to stop black's move rook takes f6. Queen d1 does that. If he were to play rook takes f6, I would play queen g4 check, and after he responds with king b8, I have the brutal rook takes b7 check. He has to play king takes b7, and after bishop takes c6 check, I've opened up a discovery between my queen on g4 and his queen on d4. At the same time, taking off the knight on c6, I win his queen on d4, and I win the game. So queen d1 was both a big attacking move, intending queen b3 and queen g4, and a defensive move. A quiet move, simply stopping rook takes f6, his most natural move. So I'm developing my attack and at the same time stopping my opponent from making his best move. And if you make slightly better moves than your opponent, and if your position is such that you can improve your position while stopping your opponent from improving his position, that advantage will slowly increase until it can explode. So after queen d1, he can no longer play rook takes f6. You might wonder what would happen if he played queen takes f6. If he had played queen takes f6, my best move is queen g4 check. You can see that my opponent would here have a number of different options. His best move is king b8. One simple way of showing you is if he were to block with the queen, queen e6, I would play bishop takes c6, opening up my rook's attack on his queen. And if he tried to throw in the in-between move, queen takes g4, I would play bishop takes b7 check, and only then take back the queen on g4, and I would be up a piece. So he would, after queen g4 check, he would have had to play king b8. Then I would have played a quiet move, rook f1, slowly improving my rook's placement and stopping him from playing queen f2, another attacking move based upon slow, slow, slow. Rook f1, he would have to play queen e7, because queen e6, after the queen trade, would give up control of the f7 point. After queen e7, I would continue the attack. His knight on c6 is defended by his rook on d6, no problem. c5, challenging that rook. My opponent would have to play rook e6. This variation is pretty much forced, and here I have two options. One is to play queen f4 check, followed by, after the king moves, queen takes f7. Notice, if he were to blockade that check with the knight, rook takes b7 would be possible, taking the space my opponent left behind. But other than queen f4 check, I have an interesting move, bishop e4 to d5, challenging the rook on e6 once again. After he plays rook e2 check, I'm allowing my opponent a check. I would play king h1, and now I have a double threat. The knight on c6 is attacked, and the pawn on f7 is attacked. My opponent's best move is to defend the knight on c6 with rook c8, and now in this position, the simple queen f4 check, king a8, queen takes f7 would lead to a completely dominant position in which both my rooks, after the queen trade, are going to be honing on the b7 point. His knight on c6 is passive, my bishop on d5 is active, all of his pawns are weak, all of my pawns are fine. Black is going to lose this game. This was just an example of a forced variation which I could have played if he had decided to take on f6 with the queen. So you can see that after queen d1, rook takes f6 is impossible, and queen takes f6 would still be very, very strong for white. So my opponent has the option of taking the pawn, but it's good for me. His best move, I think, would have been queen f2 check, and only after bishop to g2 to play queen takes f6. Force my bishop out of the center, followed by taking the pawn. And here I believe my best way would have been rook f1, once again attacking the queen and aiming at the f7 point. After queen e7, a similar move to what I played before, c5. And after rook e6, maintaining control of the c6 knight, to play the central move, d4. I'm down a pawn, but my pawns in the center are brutal. My opponent would play rook e2. Now if I rushed with d5, I would give him the option of the strange move queen to e4, trying to begin an attack against my g2 point. Not so fast. I would play the simple king h1, stopping any dreams of counterplay my opponent may have. After king h1, he would have to respond to the threat of d5 with knight d8, after which I could simply continue with either d4 to d5, continuing the central stampede. Notice he still can't play queen takes c5 because of rook c1, winning the queen. Or I could play queen b3, developing the attack this way. Black is, as you can probably tell, in huge trouble. After, for instance, d4 to d5, I have the option of playing d6, I have the option of playing c6, his knight on d8 can't move, I'm down a pawn, and I'm completely winning. So we see that after queen d1, my opponent had three different ways to take the f6 pawn, none of which were very good. Queen d1 was attacking, and at the same time was a prophylactic move. Now, did you envision the fact that the move queen d2 to d1 defended the f6 pawn? Strange idea. He played rook h to d8. Here I came out with queen b3. His b7 pawn is attacked, and it's a very hard point to defend. Now you remember earlier I was discussing the idea of the tension between my bishop on e4 and his knight on c6. What can happen in that kind of situation is that black can tend to think that the trade that I control, bishop takes c6, is not anything to worry about. It's fine. Because in all the positions we've played so far, it's been fine. In every single variation, every position he has to calculate, bishop takes c6, bishop takes c6. And it's been ingrained in his head because he's always seen that it's good for black. In this particular position, playing rook h to d8, he was wrong. After queen b3, the logical way of defending the b7 pawn is rook 8 to d7. But this position is one of those moments where the tension shows its value. After the simple bishop takes c6, black is put into quite a bind. B takes c6 is impossible because of queen b8 mate. The only other move is rook takes c6. And after I play rook e8 check, the defense of the b7 pawn is thrown into chaos. Rook d8, queen takes b7 is mate. He has to play king c7. And now, after queen takes b7, the black king is forced up to d6, and I think we can see that he's in big trouble. So after the simple move queen b3, he can't defend with rook 8 to d7. He also can't defend with rook 6 to d7, because after bishop takes c6, his only option would be to take with the b pawn, and then queen b8 would be mate. The only way for black to defend is by retreating the queen from d4 to a7. I'd like you to take a moment, though, just to understand how difficult it is to calculate always bishop takes knight, bishop takes knight, bishop takes knight, to have it constantly on your consciousness in looking at every position that white has the option of taking the knight. It becomes increasingly difficult to remember, to keep in your thought pattern, to remember, and then one time it works. My opponent played queen a7, and here I think that I made the one mistake of the game on my part. In this position, after queen a7, I saw that my position was huge, that his defenses were running out. I had been sacrificing material throughout the game. If you recall, I had pawns hanging almost all the time, and the potential to sacrifice pawns non-stop. My f6 pawn is still sitting there, but has been a goner for the whole time. He's had the option of taking it consistently. And I simply maintained that vision of the position. I played the move c4 to c5, a very tempting move which locks his queen in on a7, attacks his rook on d6, and forces it to take my pawn on f6. It's a very romantic decision. I haven't been playing materialistically at all throughout the whole game, and after c5 my position is still much, much better. But this was unnecessary. I should have played the simple move queen b2. Defend my f6 pawn. Why not? It's a beautiful piece. It's sitting there, way up the board. Pinning the pawn on f7 down is a permanent weakness. Why would I just give up the pawn? After the simple queen b2, my next move would be c5, locking his queen in, and I would get to do everything the same except to have the bonus of a pawn on f6. So, in this position, I got a little carried away by the idealism, the romanticism of sacrificing material, and I played c5. My opponent played rook takes f6. How do we continue the attack? What is my opponent's next move? What is an active option my opponent may have? Rook f2 check. My king on h2 is open. My rook on e1 is a little bit passive. What should I do? Simple move, bishop g2. By stopping his only active option before he played it, before he could even think about playing it, I frustrated Black's defenses even more. Now his rook on f6 is pinned down to the defense of the c6 knight. If he plays rook f2 now, king g1 would just kick it off the square. If you remember earlier, I played the move bishop e4 back to g2, stopping his idea. Then I came back to e4, taking a pawn. Now I simply return back to the g2 square, stopping Black's active options. In this position, I've challenged my opponent to find a move, and he couldn't figure out anything to do. He played the move a6 to a5. Now when you see a move like that, your first reaction may be, bad move, he has no idea. If you treat a grandmaster or a strong chess player without the respect to constantly look for what their idea is, you could lose a winning position in a heartbeat. My opponent's move has a very strong idea. I'm piling up on the b7 pawn. His knight on c6 can't move because of that. It would open up my bishop on g2. By playing a5, his idea is actually very nice. He wants to anchor the knight on the b4 square. If you imagine the move knight b4, suddenly my rook on b1 and my queen b3, which looked very powerful a moment ago, are blockaded by the knight. The knight can't be attacked by any of my pawns. My bishop on g2 attacking the b7 pawn is rather useless without anything else to back it up. It's a very strong defensive idea. But when he played a5, he created a defensive idea which he simply did not have time to fulfill. Now, in fact, his position is much, much worse. He doesn't have so many good things he can do. It was a good try. It's important to notice also, from what I'm about to show you, that my move bishop e4 back to g2 was a prophylactic move against a5 and knight b4. I didn't see that, but it was. And this relates to, in chess, there is, in many positions, this reality of the truth of the position. My move bishop e4 to g2 was the best move. I felt that. In my hands, I knew that bishop g2 was the correct decision, because he had the possibility of activating with rook f2. I needed to open up my rook on e1. It was the correct movement of the position. I felt that. I felt that that was the move that stuck to the flow of my attack. After bishop e4 to g2, when he played a5, how would you respond to Black's plan of locking my pieces outside of his position? I played the move queen c3, attacking his rook on f6. My idea is, after his rook moves, to put my rook on b6, inside of the b4 square. I didn't give him any chance to try to lock me outside. I just came in right away. After queen c3, my opponent played rook to f2, and my immediate option might be to play rook b6. Boom! Because I see that after rook b6, I'll be keeping his queen out, keeping everything away. But this move would probably be a little bit impatient. While it's the kind of move you want to play, because it's sort of like a locking mechanism. When you play a move like rook b6, you see physically on the board his play is stopped. But his rook on f2 maintains a little bit of activity. I waited a moment, played king g1, forcing the rook on f2 to the side. So in this position, what I did is I saw that there were no tactics to explode immediately. I put the question to the rook. His rook had to retreat back to f5, and then I played rook b6. Now let's take a moment. Why did I say that bishop g2 was a prophylactic move against a5? Let's return to the position for a moment. If it hadn't been my move, and my opponent had played a5, and I had responded with queen c3, he could have played rook f2 with check. A small little detail, which is rather relevant. If I come back now with bishop g2, then it's his move, and he can play knight b4, locking my rook outside. I could play king g1, attacking the rook immediately, But then after he keeps the active rook, rook a2, my position is still very strong, but I've allowed him to activate a little bit, and my king on g1 is a little more open than I would like it to be. This position would still be very good for me, but it's best to stop as many of his resources as I can. So after he played a5, I played queen c3, attacking the rook, moving my queen away with tempo, preparing to lock myself inside of his position. He played rook f2. I played king g1, drove the rook back to f5, and then played rook b6. Now my position is winning. What does that mean? When you have a winning position, what does it mean? It does not mean that the game is over. When someone says my position is winning, it is the most dangerous moment in their psychology as a competitor. And in fact, during the game, I didn't say when I played rook b6 my position is winning, but I felt that the objective truth of the position now was that if I played correctly, there was no way for black to resist my attack any longer. After rook b6, my threat is bishop takes c6, and after b takes c6, rook takes c6 check, which will come to a mate quickly. My opponent played queen b8, trying by any means to let the queen breathe. Now remember I just said my position was winning? Does that put in you the emotional need to just crash in and win immediately? Isn't the most natural move here bishop takes c6? The pawn on b7 can't recapture because the rook takes b8. Looks winning for me. If I were to play that move, I would lose. Queen takes g3 check. After I retreat with bishop g2, my opponent would simply play rook f5 to f2, and there is no way to defend against mate on the g2 square. So my position is very good. I've reached a moment where his defenses are about to fall apart. But if I still make one inaccuracy, if I get overconfident, if I get material, if I start to think of the position in terms of being winning, if I start to think about what I'm going to do after the game, one mistake and all the hard work, all the good moves will fall apart. He threatened my g3 pawn. I continued my attack while stopping his ideas. I played d4. This move has two ideas once again. It has the threat of maybe playing d4 to d5, pushing him backwards, continuing my attack, and it simply defends my g3 pawn. My queen on c3 now defends g3. My opponent tried somehow to continue rook g5. At this point in the game, what he's doing is he's attacking anything he can because that's all he can do. This is like the black position is a time bomb. I played king h2, another patient move. See, these kinds of moves are very hard to play. Patient moves right before you win. The 2 or 3 slow moves you have to make just before it all ends. And now black has no way of holding on. My threat is bishop takes c6. His pawn on b7 is pinned. His only reasonable move is queen c7. After he played queen c7, what would you do? This is a very dangerous moment in competition. His little counterattack didn't work. Now we know it's time to end it all. How do we do it? Your first emotional reaction may be, come on, man, let's keep the attack going. d5. Let's roll the pawns at him. This would be a huge mistake. By playing d5, it's true I try to kick the knight out and then keep on pushing in the center. What I allow him to do is a very typical defensive idea of sacrificing an exchange to stop my attack. He would simply play rook g takes d5. And suddenly I would feel like a total idiot. After bishop takes d5, rook takes d5, the knight on c6, instead of being vulnerable, is a solid piece. He has 2 pawns. Yes, I can win a pawn probably later. But right now he has 2 pawns for the exchange. His knight on c6 is strong. By playing rook d8, his king on c8 will be strong. And my king on h2 is wide open. In this position, black has very good defensive chances. Very good counter chances. Here I'm on the edge, on the very brink of victory. Gotta make the right decision. I piled up on the point that he can no longer defend. Rook e to b1. The b7 pawn can't be defended by anything else than the queen and the king. If he tries to blockade by playing knight b4, I've already gotten 1 rook inside, and by playing knight b4, he opens up my bishop onto the b7 square, so I can take it. After rook b1, black has nothing. My threat, if it were my move, is simple. Rook takes b7, forcing queen takes b7. And after rook takes b7, king takes b7. I can play queen b3 check, attacking the king. If he moves backwards, I can take on c6. If he plays king c7, I'll play queen b6 check, and the knight on c6 will fall, and I'll mate him very quickly. After rook e to b1, my opponent's position has reached the point where it can no longer be held. the b7 pawn is falling. He has no other option but to try to give back some material to hold on in some other means. He played rook g to d5, opening up my bishop onto the rook. It's the only way to blockade the diagonal. Now, in this position, most players would have, once again, a reaction which would be to quickly take on d5. That would be a mistake. There's no reason to rush. First, I played rook takes b7. His queen has nowhere to go, so he has to play queen takes b7. And after rook takes b7, king takes b7. How would you win the game? So right now you're sitting across from a Grandmaster. You're in the last round of a strong open tournament. There's a whole crowd of people around. You've just passed the time control. You have an hour for your next 20 moves. What is your next move? One option might be to play bishop takes d5, take the rook. That's possible, but not correct. Another option may be to play queen b3 check, attacking both the rook on d5 and the king on b7. But both threats can be met by knight b4. The check is blocked and the knight defends the d5 square. After queen b3, check, knight b4, if I play bishop takes d5, he would respond with rook takes d5. The rook is defended by the knight, and suddenly my d4 pawn is a little bit weak. Black has ways to create counterplay. This position would be very hard to win. It's very dangerous in this kind of position to get overconfident. Let me show you one position, just so you understand how difficult it is to win such positions. Let's take off a lot of pieces. This position is a draw. I have a queen for a rook, but there's absolutely no way for me to get in. Fool around with this. He simply moves his king back and forth. If I ever break with g4, he trades. Then his rook can move back and forth between the h5 and the f5 squares. There's no way for white to win this position. The reason I show you this is because if we return to this position, we see that if I were to take on d5 and he were to respond with rook takes d5, while it looks winning before we know that, suddenly we realize that all black would have to do is trade off a knight and a pawn for 2 pawns, shuttle the king to the king side, and suddenly it's a draw. There's a fortress. So while my position is on the brink of being completely winning, while it's almost over, if I play a little impatiently, black can suddenly have good drawing chances. I played the move queen to c4. His rook on d5 is attacked. It can't move. If rook d7 or rook takes d4, I would play queen b5 check, followed by winning the knight on c6 quickly. My opponent played knight b4. His rook on d5 can still be taken. Not so fast. I played queen b5 check. Still patiently. My opponent played king c8. And only now that my queen is inside of his position did I play the simple move bishop takes d5. If he responds with knight takes d5, after I play c6, the b7 square is undefendable. He's going to get mated. His only move is rook takes d5. And after queen e8 check, his kingside pawns start to fall. Queen e8 check, king c7, queen takes f7 check, rook d7, queen takes g6, and here we see that the win is obvious. So I had the option of taking the rook immediately, but what I did, I played a few moves first to get the queen inside of his position, took some pawns, and now it's winning. After queen takes g6, he fought on with knight c6. Queen b6 check takes a5 was a threat. His only remaining weapon is the pawn on a5. If it gets up to the a2 square and he can get the rook behind it, he'll feel like maybe he can have some counterplay. I played queen takes h6. My opponent played rook takes d4. At this point, people can see that white is winning, but once again, you have to play correctly. I played queen g7 check. He came back with rook d7. And I played a move which stopped his idea. His next move, as you can see, would probably be to try to push the pawn, a5 to a4. I stopped it. Queen f6. Even now, when my position is completely winning, I'm up material, his king is wide open, my h-pawn is going to be going to the h8 square very soon, I still take into account my opponent's counter chances. If he plays a4 now, it makes with queen f4 check, takes a4. He just loses the pawn. He played rook d2 check. And I played king h1. Why? In the endgame, you want to centralize your king. That's a rule. The most natural move would be to play king g1. What is the logic behind king to h1? Let me first of all say that both moves would win. King g1 would win and king h1 would win. What I'm doing by playing king h1 is limiting my opponent's counter chances the most I possibly can. The reason I didn't play king g1 is completely abstract. The point is that there is a drawing scheme in this kind of position which is very tricky. If you know it, it's very good. If you take away my white queen for a moment and you put his knight on d4, black has a forced draw, no matter what other material is on the board, by playing knight f3 check, king to f1. If king h1, then rook h2 is mate. King to f1, knight h2 check, king to e1, knight f3 check, king f1, knight h2 check. If I go to g1, knight f3 check again. There's no way for the king to get out of that little net. This little net between knight and rook can force a draw in a very savvy way. Watch out for that. So after rook d2 check, I played king h1 because I'd be one move further away from that netting idea that black may have. In fact, he couldn't achieve it here, but I limited his chances the most I could. My opponent played king b7. Reason being he has to get the king out of the checks because I'm threatening queen f4 check to pick off his rook on d2. I should note, if you were to try to annoy my king more by playing rook d1 check, I would simply play king g2, and after rook d2 check, after king f3, my king is going to come up to the g4 square. If, for instance, knight d4, he has no more checks, my king is safe, and now I can continue the attack. The lone rook can't do anything to it, give my king problems. After king b7, I played queen f7 check, king c8. And now my pawn started to march up the board to h4. He played a4, and now I had something waiting for him, queen c4, getting rid of his last little warrior. a3, queen a6 check. You'll see there's no other way for him really to do anything useful. If he were to play rook d4 to defend the pawn, after queen a6 check, king c7, queen b6 check, king d7, queen b7 check, I win the knight on c6. King d7. My opponent's last little trick. He wanted me to play queen b7 check here. And after king d8, queen takes c6. I've won a knight. It's funny that this position is a little trickier than it should be. He can play the move a2. And it's hard to stop the square. In fact, this position is winning after I play queen a4. Black's threat was to play both a1 queen and, if possible, rook b2 to b1 check. I have a queen and two pawns up against a lone rook. This position would be winning, but if you look at it, you'll see it's a little more difficult than I wanted it to be. So I simply took the pawn on a3, giving him no chances. He played knight e5, and I continued to push forward with h5. At this point, I've seen that his attacking ideas are not working. He might, if he were to play the moves knight f3 and rook h2, that would be mate, but I see that he doesn't have time for it. It's also important to note that my queen, with his king on the open board, makes virtually all of his different moves impossible. For instance, if he plays the move knight to g4, queen a4 check picks off the knight, attacking the king on d7, the knight on g4. If his king is on a dark square, for instance, c7, queen a5 check immediately picks off the rook. Then, of course, we can take the next step to these tactics to give you an idea of how complex black's position is to play, how difficult. If I am to play queen a4 check, suddenly I'm throwing a rock into his game. King c7 is impossible because of queen a5 check. Similarly, king d8. He has to go to light square. I have more checks. So in this kind of position, black has to constantly take into consideration all of his pieces not hanging. He couldn't do anything active with his knight because he would lose a piece. He played king e6. Now his idea is to bring his king up as close as he can to my king and try to create a mating net with rook, knight, and king. I just saw he couldn't do it. After king e6, I played h6, came up one more square. He played rook d1 check, king g2, rook d2 check, king h3, and he played king f5. After king f5, part of his idea may be if I play h7 to play rook d1 with the idea of picking off the queen, consider h8 queen, rook h1 check, and then taking it. I just made things simple by playing queen e3, a move which stops all of his ideas. For one thing, I'm attacking his rook. He has to respond to that threat. And at this moment in the game, I saw his eyes light up for just a heartbeat. He has the little shot, rook h2 check, a sacrifice to force my king onto a forking square. King takes h2, knight g4 check, and suddenly he's winning a queen. But after king g1, knight takes e3, I would simply play h7. And he can't stop the pawn, and I make a queen. My impression of him psychologically was that for a moment he saw the tactic and he lit up and then immediately saw the next move and then fell back. After queen e3, because of the fact that that tactic doesn't work, of course saw it. He played rook d1 with the idea of if I push my pawn he'll pick it off with rook h1 check, and after g4 check he resigned. After g4 check we see he has to move the king. If he comes to e6, I pick off his rook with queen b3 check. The rook falls. So the only real move is to play king f6, at which point I saw I had queen f4 check attacking the king. He has to defend the knight with king e6. Then I would play queen f5 check, attacking the king again. He would come to d5, and now that his knight is pinned, it can't move. I can continue to push my pawns up the board, for instance with h7 because the pawn is defended, and he has no way to stop me from queening. And he resigned after I played g4 check. After this game, it was interesting. A whole slew of grandmasters came over and started analyzing it, and it's always a wonderful experience to sit at the table with some of the greatest chess minds in the world and seeing them approach a position, seeing the different movements. This one grandmaster, very strong Russian grandmaster named Alexander Kalifman, was sitting there analyzing my opponent Blatny, a German grandmaster Christian Gabriel, and we were analyzing, all of us, the position. And over my shoulder, I kept hearing this voice, and I wasn't sure who it was. Sometimes happens, and we were analyzing, and I was responding, describing my ideas. We were looking at these very complicated middle games, much of which you have already seen. And this voice kept on coming, and I would respond to the voice, and I was amazed at how impressive the ideas were. And at one moment I turned around to see who it was, expecting just to see a chess player who was having a good day, and it was this Robert Hübner, one of the strongest grandmasters in the world, a very strong German grandmaster, describing the position. And it was a very beautiful experience, sitting with all these great players, seeing their ideas. So this was a very big game for me to win.